the summer of 1985, a young couple, freshly married and beaming with the promise of a new life, vanished without a trace. They seemed to disappear off the face of the earth along with their brand-new Ford Thunderbird, just hours after their wedding ceremony. For over a decade, the mystery lingered like an open wound. No leads, no closure, only silence. Then, in an unexpected twist 12 years later, a discovery from a university research project cracked open the case once more. A group of college students, while analyzing satellite imagery for an environmental study in the Everglades, spotted something strange. An unusual pale yellow shape submerged in the dark waters of the marshlands. They had no idea their observation would revive a long, cold mystery and lead to revelations no one was prepared for. On that ordinary morning in 1997, sunlight filtered over the parking lot of a Walmart in Homestead, Florida. Linda Carroll, a 56-year-old woman with streaks of silver in her hair and years of quiet sorrow etched into her face, was pushing her shopping cart through the produce section. She examined each tomato, each head of lettuce, not just out of habit but as a kind of ritual. A way to distract herself from the gaping void left behind since the summer her only daughter, Melissa, vanished. The sharp ring of a cell phone pierced the moment. Linda fumbled inside her bag, nearly dropping a net of oranges. Cell phones were still uncommon then. Hers had been a prize won in a supermarket sweepstakes. "Hello? Mrs. Carroll, this is Detective Jason Pram with the Homestead Police Department. May I ask where you are right now?" Her heart stopped. She had received dozens, maybe hundreds of calls over the years, all promising answers, all leading nowhere. But something in this man's calm and deliberate tone made her grip the phone tighter. "I'm at Walmart," she said, "just getting a few things." "Why?" "We need you to come to Everglades National Park as soon as possible. We've discovered something related to your daughter, Melissa, and her husband, Brandon." The words struck like thunder. Her fingers trembled so violently she nearly dropped the phone. "What have you found?" "We've recovered a yellow Ford Thunderbird from the swamp. We need you to come identify it. The Whitmore family has also been contacted. We're gathering at the main parking area near the park entrance." For a moment, Linda couldn't move. She stood frozen among the vegetables and startled shoppers, her mind spiraling. Then, without another thought, she abandoned her cart and rushed to her car. The oranges rolled away unnoticed. The drive to Everglades took less than 30 minutes, but it felt eternal. Along the route, her mind overflowed with memories. Melissa's bright smile in her wedding dress, her laughter echoing through the house, the bittersweet goodbye on the front steps. That day had felt full of hope, not knowing it would be the last time she'd see her daughter. After the couple's disappearance, police initially concluded they had run off voluntarily, perhaps to start fresh. But Linda had never believed that. As a single mother who raised Melissa through hardship, she knew her daughter deeply. Melissa wouldn't have vanished without a word. Yet the years of silence eroded even her strongest convictions, and resignation eventually replaced hope. At the park, chaos reigned. Police cruisers crowded the entrance, red and blue lights flashed in the early sunlight. Rescue vehicles and official trucks formed a jagged line along the edge of the marsh. Rangers directed traffic while officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape. Linda stepped out of her car, her legs shaky. She maneuvered through a crowd of rangers, curious tourists, and officials, her eyes searching for only one thing: the vehicle. There it was, hoisted on a flatbed trailer. The yellow Thunderbird, once gleaming with the polish of new beginnings, was now coated in algae, mud streaking its sides like the tears of time. Water dripped from its undercarriage in steady drops, as if it were weeping for the years lost. The windows were darkened, clouded by grime and moisture, but Linda recognized it instantly. It was the same car that Brandon's father, Gregory Whitmore, had proudly gifted the couple, a token of wealth and status. She remembered how he insisted on posing for dozens of photos beside the car, capturing what he thought was the start of something perfect. "Mrs. Carroll," a voice called behind her. She turned to see a tired-looking man, perhaps in his 40s, with worry lines creased deep across his face. "Detective Jason Pram. I called you earlier." Linda pointed toward the car. "How? How did you find it after all these years?" "Someone else should explain that part," he said, leading her to a small group wearing University of Miami shirts. A student with tousled brown hair and a thoughtful expression stepped forward. "Jake Morrison, ma'am. My team's been researching environmental changes in the Everglades. We were analyzing historical satellite images when we noticed something odd. In one photo from 1985, there was this strange yellow shape in the water. We enhanced the image and, well, it looked like a car." He handed her a printout. Grainy, low resolution, but unmistakable. A pale yellow outline submerged in dark water. Our professor remembered the story of the couple that disappeared and reached out to authorities. Once they matched the coordinates, recovery crews planned the extraction. Detective Prom picked up where Jake left off. "It wasn't easy. That part of the swamp is nearly inaccessible. Deep water, unstable ground, dense brush. We needed sonar, divers, even a helicopter to lift the car out. Took nearly 4 hours." Linda nodded silently. Her eyes returned to the vehicle. That car had carried her daughter away from the church into what should have been a honeymoon. Instead, it had become her tomb. Linda stood motionless, the weight of years pressing on her chest. She reached into her purse for a tissue, but her hands trembled. A dozen reporters lingered behind the barrier, cameras flashing occasionally, as though sensing the gravity of this moment. Detective Pram gently placed a hand on her arm. "Would you like to sit down for a moment?" She shook her head. "I've waited 12 years. I can stand." Around her, the Everglades were quiet, save for the hum of distant insects and the soft ripple of wind through the grass. Linda tried to imagine what her daughter had seen in those final moments. Was she frightened? Did she call out? Jake, the student, stepped forward again. "We also found fragments of fabric and a bracelet stuck between the front seats. The forensic team is analyzing them now." Lyndon's breath caught. A bracelet? It had the name Melissa engraved on it, very worn but still legible. A tear traced down Linda's cheek. That bracelet had been a birthday gift when Melissa turned 16. Small, silver, delicate, a symbol of youth and promise. Now it was the first real piece of her daughter she had touched in more than a decade. For the first time in years, Linda felt something inside her begin to shift. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was the first thread of truth, fragile and trembling, reaching back through 12 long years of silence. Linda watched as the flatbed truck was prepared to transport the vehicle. The air was heavy with tension, silence thick around the gathered crowd. Just then she heard the unmistakable slam of car doors behind her. Turning around, she saw the Whitmore family stepping out of a sleek black sedan. Gregory Whitmore, still carrying himself with the same air of confidence he'd always had, led the way. Time had placed lines on his face, but his sharp gaze hadn't dulled. Behind him came Eleanor, his wife, as poised and proper as ever, her expression unreadable. Lastly, Daniel followed, taller now, older, quieter. It had been years, 12 long, bitter ones, but Linda recognized them immediately. Their arrival stirred a wave of old resentment in her. The last time they had spoken, it had ended in a storm of harsh words. Gregory had accused Melissa of manipulating Brandon, of dragging him into a world below his class. He spoke of her daughter as if love could be calculated in dollars and inheritance. Detective Prom stepped away from Linda and moved to greet the Whitmores, explaining the discovery and what was expected of them. Linda remained at a distance, her eyes never leaving Gregory's face as he examined the mud-covered vehicle. His facade cracked just slightly, an involuntary twitch of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. "That's it," he said, voice low but clear. "That's the Thunderbird I gave Brandon as a wedding present." He gestured toward the license plate, barely visible through a coating of grime. "FTB 1985. I paid extra to get it custom." Despite her misgivings, Linda approached. Her voice was tight. "Still think she ran off with your son to escape her situation?" Gregory looked at her, the years having worn down some of his arrogance. "I don't know what to think anymore," he replied, slower than expected. Eleanor stepped forward, her composure flickering. "We all lost something that day, Linda." "Some more than others," Linda said, her voice soft but firm. Detective Prom gently intervened, leading them away from the vehicle. "Let's go inside the ranger station," he suggested. "There are forms to complete and some preliminary results from the forensics team." Inside the small station, air conditioning hummed quietly as they gathered around a long wooden table. A crime scene technician placed a clear plastic evidence bag on the surface. Inside was a small strip of floral fabric, and next to it, a delicate silver bracelet, tarnished but intact. Linda reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the plastic. "That's hers," she whispered. "That's Melissa's. I gave her that bracelet when she turned 16. The room fell silent. The technician continued. "This fabric was recovered from the passenger seat area. It matches the description of the sundress Melissa was last seen wearing. There's also hair strands and bone fragments being tested now." Gregory, who had remained standing, slowly sat down. He rubbed his eyes. 12 years. And all this time it was here. Pram nodded. "The vehicle was submerged in about 10 feet of water. Our sonar scan only picked up metal distortion because the water levels have dropped recently." Jake Morrison, the student who had discovered the anomaly, entered the room with a laptop in hand. He connected it to a monitor and brought up the satellite images. "Here," he said, pointing. "This image was taken in late 1985. That yellow mark, right there, is your car. The foliage and seasonal flooding made it invisible for over a decade." Linda leaned in, eyes wide. "So close." "It's not uncommon," Jake added. "The Everglades swallows things. It's vast and wild. Without a specific search grid, it's almost impossible to find something unless it resurfaces." The conversation turned clinical, discussing further excavation, insurance documentation, potential criminal inquiries. But Linda's thoughts drifted. She stared at the bracelet, remembering the way Melissa's wrist had looked. Slim, graceful, always moving as she talked excitedly about books, music, dreams. Daniel, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "We fought that night," he said suddenly. "Brandon and me, at the reception." Everyone turned toward him. "About what?" Pram asked. Daniel hesitated. "He told me he didn't want to move to New York anymore. He and Melissa wanted to stay in Florida. Said they had other plans. I told him he was being stupid, throwing away the job our dad got him lined up with. We argued, and I stormed off. That was the last time I saw him." The tension in the room deepened. "Did you tell the police this back then?" Pram asked. Daniel shook his head. "No one asked. Everyone just assumed they left willingly. No one thought something had gone wrong." Linda stood. Her voice trembled but carried weight. "You all made up your minds about Melissa, that she wasn't good enough, that she lured Brandon away, but she was kind. She was honest. She deserved better than to be forgotten." Gregory looked down, shame flickering in his features. "You're right," he admitted. "We were too proud." Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting harsh light across the Everglades. The stillness was deceptive, hiding layers of history, secrets, and sorrow beneath its surface. The ranger station now felt like the epicenter of something larger, of truth long buried finally clawing its way to daylight. Detective Pran tapped his pen thoughtfully against the folder in front of him. We're treating this as a potential crime scene. It's too early to draw conclusions, but the location of the car, its condition, and the absence of external damage raise questions. Eleanor clutched her purse tighter. What do you mean? That someone did this deliberately? We're not ruling anything out, he replied. It's possible the car slid off the road accidentally, especially if the couple was unfamiliar with the terrain or driving at night. But it's also possible someone intended for it never to be found. Linda's hands were clenched on the table, and if it was deliberate, then we'll find out who did it. That's our job. Jake hesitated before speaking. There's something else. When we mapped the surrounding vegetation patterns and ground sediment, we found signs the soil around the car had been disturbed. It suggests the vehicle might have been pushed, not just driven, into the swamp. A hush fell again. Gregory leaned back, exhaling sharply. God help us. Graham nodded grimly. We'll be coordinating with homicide and cold case investigators starting tomorrow. If foul play is confirmed, we'll reopen the case fully. Outside the station, clouds began to gather over the horizon. A breeze picked up, rustling the palm fronds near the water. Linda stepped out into the daylight, eyes searching the vast landscape. Somewhere out there, the truth had waited. Silent, submerged, patient. But now, at last, it had begun to surface. She whispered to herself, I will know what happened, no matter how long it takes. And this time, she wasn't alone. The room had become a time capsule, sealed in sorrow. Melissa's favorite sundress still hung over the back of the desk chair, untouched for over a decade. On the nightstand, trinkets and faded photographs remained where she had last left them, like fragile relics clinging to memory. But time, as always, had left its mark. The open closet held clothes now speckled with mold, their colors faded into shadows of the past. The fabric had thinned, become brittle. Stuffed animals sat limply on the bed, their matted fur and dull button eyes silent witnesses to years gone by. Linda stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. Oh, baby girl, she whispered, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of grief and memory. She moved to the window and flung it open, allowing sunlight and fresh air to flood the stale room. It was the first time in years she had truly entered the space, not just to dust or straighten a photo frame, but to face what remained. She descended into the garage to retrieve cardboard boxes and cleaning supplies, her limbs moving on autopilot. If the police were reopening the investigation, they might need access to Melissa's belongings, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to begin the long, painful process of packing them away. She wasn't sure if it was closure or something else entirely, but the impulse was undeniable. Back upstairs, she started with the closet, gently lifting each garment from its hanger. Her hands trembled as she folded Melissa's high school graduation dress, the soft white fabric now yellowed with time. She remembered how radiant her daughter had looked crossing the stage, beaming with pride, waving at her from across the auditorium. That day had felt like the beginning of everything. Each item she touched unleashed a memory. A floral blouse Melissa wore on her first date with Brandon. A lavender skirt she had saved for by working weekends at a diner. A sweatshirt from a beach trip with friends, still faintly smelling of salt and sunblock. Linda laid each piece in the boxes with reverence, as if they were sacred artifacts from a life interrupted too soon. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, she found a small wooden jewelry box. It creaked as it opened, revealing a handful of rings, costume jewelry, and a folded note. Linda's heart jumped as she carefully unfolded the paper. It was a letter addressed to Brandon, written in Melissa's familiar, loopy handwriting. Brandon, I know things are complicated right now, and I'm scared too, but I believe in us. No matter what our families think, No matter how hard it gets, I believe we're doing the right thing. I love you more than I can say. Forever, M. Tears spilled down Linda's cheeks. Her daughter had been frightened. The letter was never sent, never read. She wondered if Brandon had ever seen this message, if he had known how deeply Melissa had needed reassurance in those final days. Downstairs, the phone rang, jolting Linda from her thoughts. She rushed to answer, wiping her hands on her jeans. It was Detective Pram. "Mrs. Carroll, we've received the first batch of results from the forensic lab. There's something you need to hear." Her stomach tightened. "Go on." "The fragments recovered from the car match Melissa's dental records. We also found a second set, believed to be Brandon's, and we've identified something else. There were signs that the brake lines had been tampered with." Linda gasped. "You mean it wasn't an accident?" "It appears not. We're treating this as a homicide investigation." A cold, steady wave of shock settled over her. She had feared something terrible for years, but to hear it confirmed, to know that someone had intentionally ended her daughter's life, was a different kind of horror. "Do you have any suspects?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We are looking into everyone who had contact with them in those final days. That includes both families, friends, wedding guests, anyone who might have had a motive." Linda stared at the boxes scattered around Melissa's room. Somewhere in these remnants, these shirts, letters, keepsakes, there might be answers. She suddenly felt compelled to keep going, to dig deeper, to remember more. She spent the afternoon sorting through photographs in yearbooks, postcards, and trinkets. Behind an old-school binder, she found a second letter, this one unfinished. It appeared to be a journal entry. "I'm afraid of what will happen if we stay. Brandon says we should leave now, before his father changes his mind again. He's scared too, but he hides it better. I keep having this dream where we're driving down a road that disappears into fog. I don't know what it means." That evening, Linda sat on the porch with the letters beside her, the sky darkening into twilight. She read and reread Melissa's words, trying to piece together what had been missed. The signs had been there: uncertainty, tension, fear. Just as the first stars appeared, her neighbor Helen walked over carrying a pie. "I heard the news," Helen said gently. "I can't imagine how hard this is." Linda nodded. "It's a lot, but it's also something. After 12 years of silence, we're finally hearing her voice again." Helen placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. She was a bright soul, everyone knew that. "If there's anything I can do." "There might be," Lyndon said, an idea beginning to form. "Do you remember anything odd from that week? Anyone who seemed angry at Melissa or Brandon?" Helen paused, her brow furrowing. "Actually, now that you mention it, there was a man. I saw him arguing with Brandon outside the reception hall. I didn't think much of it then, but it looked serious." Linda's breath caught. "Can you describe him?" His tall, dark hair, expensive suit, older. I assumed he was family." Linda's heart sank. She had a sinking suspicion she already knew who it was. And suddenly, the pieces began shifting into place. The name that sat unspoken on Linda's tongue now burned in her mind: Gregory Whitmore. He had never approved of Melissa, that much was clear. His attitude at the wedding had been icy, his tone curt. Brandon had confided in her once, briefly, that his father threatened to cut him off financially if he didn't reconsider the marriage. But Brandon chose love. Chose Melissa. And perhaps someone couldn't stand that choice. Linda went inside and began gathering everything she had collected from Melissa's room. She placed the journal pages and the letter in a folder, labeling it for Detective Pram. If there was a way to finally uncover the truth, it would start with the words her daughter had left behind. They were more than just memories now. They were evidence. As the moon rose, Linda stared out the window. The darkness outside no longer felt like emptiness. It was filled with voices, memories, warnings. She wouldn't ignore them again. She picked up the phone and called the detective. "I have something," she said. "You'll want to see this." Her voice was steady now, strengthened by a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She had been waiting for answers. Now, she was ready to find them. The small velvet box was still sealed, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust. Linda examined it carefully, her heart beating faster. The price tag, $200.00, still clung to the underside. Even in 1985, that had been a considerable sum for a piece of jewelry. "Why would Brandon keep this?" she asked aloud, her voice tinged with confusion and dread. "If some other man was sending my daughter gifts like this." Eleanor nodded gravely. "That's what we can't understand. Brandon wasn't the type to ignore things like this. He was protective. Jealous, even. If he knew about someone named Otis giving Melissa expensive gifts, he wouldn't have just hidden it in a closet." Linda closed the lid with a firm snap. "We need to bring this to Detective Pram. This could be important. It might be a clue no one ever followed up on." "I agree," Daniel said, already moving to gather the items. "I'll come with you to the police station." "I'll stay here," Eleanor added, "in case Gregory returns. He won't be pleased about any of this, but the police need to know." Linda nodded and clutched the box containing Melissa's personal belongings while Daniel carefully slipped the velvet box into a protective bag. As they stepped into the humid afternoon, a strange sense of urgency pulsed between them. Whoever this Otis was, he could be the key to everything. They walked to the garage, Daniel leading the way. The Whitmore garage resembled a luxury showroom. The floor gleamed, polished to a mirror shine, and the walls displayed a curated collection of framed automotive posters. Rows of tools were arranged meticulously, and a lingering scent of motor oil and leather hung in the air. Parked near the back was an old but pristine BMW. Daniel unlocked it with a soft beep and motioned for Linda to climb in. As the engine purred to life, she looked out the window, clutching the box in her lap like it was something sacred. During the drive, Daniel glanced at her nervously. "You don't think my father had anything to do with this, do you?" Linda hesitated. "I don't know what to think anymore. But if Brandon suspected something, or if there was pressure from someone close to him, that could explain a lot." Daniel nodded slowly. "My father's always been controlling, especially when it came to the family name. Brandon marrying Melissa, that wasn't part of his plan. But I never thought he'd go that far." They drove in silence the rest of the way, both lost in thought. At the station, Detective Pram met them in his office, eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the box. "What did you find?" he asked. Linda opened it on his desk. "A jewelry box, hidden in the Whitmore's house, with a price tag still attached. We believe it might have been a gift from someone named Otis." Pram's expression grew serious. He examined the box carefully, noting every detail. "And you say it was hidden?" "In a closet," Daniel confirmed. "Not in Brandon's room exactly, but a storage area near the back. It was wrapped in a scarf, almost like someone didn't want it to be found." Pram made a note. "Otis. That name didn't come up in the original investigation. I'll check it against guest lists, credit card records, anything we can pull from that time. This might be the first real lead we've had." "Do you think it could be a motive?" Linda asked. "Someone Melissa was seeing? Or someone obsessed with her?" "It's too early to say," Pram replied. "But if someone felt they were losing her, or if they were being kept a secret, that kind of desperation can turn dangerous." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Could it be someone from Brandon's side, trying to make it look like she was cheating? Pram looked up sharply. "That's a possibility, too. We can't rule anything out." What matters is that we investigate every angle. He photographed the box and bagged it as evidence, logging the find. I'll also see if there are any old surveillance tapes from the wedding venue. Anyone matching that name, or even guests who seemed out of place. Linda felt the familiar ache in her chest, the pain of not knowing, but for the first time she also felt a spark of hope. A name, a clue, a thread that might lead somewhere. Outside, Daniel walked her back to the car. "I hope this leads to something," he said softly. "So do," Linda replied. "Melissa deserves that much." As she drove home, clouds began to gather on the horizon, a low rumble of thunder echoing in the distance. She welcomed the storm. Maybe it would wash away the dust of the past. Maybe it would reveal what had been buried for too long. She parked, carried the folder of Melissa's writings inside, and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. Then she picked up the phone. "Detective Prom?" she said when he answered. "Yes? There's something else. I think I need to show you Melissa's letters. I'll come by in the morning." Linda hung up, her fingers tracing the spine of the folder. Somewhere in these pages, her daughter's voice lived on. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead them to the truth. Later that night, Linda couldn't sleep. She sat at the dining table, a cup of tea cooling untouched in front of her. The storm had rolled in fully now, thunder cracking in the distance, sheets of rain slapping against the windows. It felt oddly appropriate, as if the weather understood the unrest inside her. She reread Melissa's letters again, each word digging a little deeper into her heart. The writing spoke of hope and fear, of dreams and doubts. It was clear that Melissa had been navigating something complicated, perhaps even dangerous. Linda had missed the signs back then, caught up in wedding planning and trying to be supportive. She opened an old photo album and flipped through the pages. There was Melissa at age 10, proudly holding a science fair ribbon. There she was at 16, dressed up for prom, and finally one of her in the wedding gown. Radiant, hopeful, unaware of what lay ahead. Linda stared at that photo for a long time. The doorbell rang. She jumped, heart pounding. Who would be visiting at this hour? Peering through the peephole, she saw Eleanor Whitmore standing on the porch, drenched from the rain, her umbrella turned inside out by the wind. Linda opened the door. "Eleanor? What are you doing here?" Eleanor stepped inside, water pooling at her feet. "I couldn't sleep either." "I've been thinking about that name, Otis." Linda guided her to the kitchen. "You remembered something." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "It wasn't a friend of Melissa's. It was a business partner of Gregory's, Otis Graham. He was intense, older, rich, eccentric. He once came to dinner and wouldn't stop talking about art, philosophy, and Melissa." Linda's stomach turned. "Did Brandon know?" "I'm not sure." Gregory dismissed it as harmless admiration, but something about it never sat right with me. Linda leaned forward. "This could be important. We need to tell Prom tomorrow." The storm howled louder outside, but within the kitchen a plan was forming. One rooted in clarity, determination, and something Linda hadn't truly felt in years. Purpose. The jingle of keys rang sharp in the warm Florida air, catching Linda's attention instantly. Her eyes zeroed in on the small cluster dangling from Gregory's hand. Among them, one particular key stood out. It had a worn, handwritten label attached to it. Though partially obscured, Linda could make out a large, looping O at the beginning of the faded writing. Her mind flashed to the name Eleanor had mentioned the night before. Otis. Before she could lean in to read more, Gregory reacted. With a speed that surprised both her and Daniel, he snatched the keychain back into his grip. "Dad, what was—" Daniel began, but Gregory cut him off. "Nothing, just keys to the office. "Storage units," he said flatly, stuffing them hastily into his coat pocket. Too hastily. His hand trembled slightly as he did so. "I'll take your car to the office," he announced. "You two, handle whatever it is you need to do. Just don't take all day." And with that, Gregory turned on his heel and strode toward Daniel's BMW, opening the door and sliding in without another word. The car roared to life and peeled away down the long driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and questions. Linda stared after him. "Your father seems tense." Daniel sighed. "He's been like that since Brandon and Melissa disappeared. Throws himself into work, snaps at everyone. Mom says it's how he processes grief." He shrugged, clearly frustrated. "Shall we head back?" "I don't mind driving," Lyndon replied, still distracted. Her thoughts churned over the keychain, the rushed way Gregory had reacted. Was it her imagination, or had there been more than just an O on that tag? Why had he been so quick to hide it? Back at the Whitmore estate, the air inside the grand house was thick with tension. Eleanor greeted them in the entryway, her eyes immediately scanning for Gregory. "Left," Daniel said. "Said he was heading to the office." Eleanor pressed her lips together. "I doubt that. He's been hiding something for years. If we ever want the truth, we need to look where he won't let us." Linda nodded slowly. "Where does he keep old files, documents from before the wedding?" Daniel looked uncertain. "There's a locked cabinet in his study. He told us it held financial records, tax stuff. But he never lets anyone near it. And that's where we start," Eleanor said firmly. Daniel retrieved a thin ring of house keys from a drawer and led them down the hall. The study was dim, lined with bookshelves and heavy wooden furniture. A large antique desk dominated the room. Against the far wall stood a tall, dark filing cabinet, its metal exterior gleaming dully. Daniel tried several keys. On the third attempt, there was a soft click. The drawer slid open. Inside were thick folders, meticulously organized, labeled by year and project. Some bore corporate logos, others were plain, marked only by numbers. Daniel pulled one labeled 1985 Personal and laid it on the desk. The folder contained handwritten notes, typed letters, invoices, and photographs. Linda flipped through them slowly. One showed Brandon in the driveway, looking up at the house, a concerned expression on his face. Another showed Melissa standing beside an unfamiliar car, speaking with a man in a dark suit. The photo was grainy, taken from a distance, but her posture was tense. There was a letter too, signed Otis Graham. It read like a warning, cloaked in politeness. "Dear Gregory," it began, "I must reiterate my concern regarding the union between your son and the young woman. Her background and temperament make her an ill fit for your family's expectations. Please remember our conversation and act with discretion. I trust you'll do what's best." Linda looked up sharply. "This is him." "Otis." Eleanor read over her shoulder. So they were in contact, and Gregory didn't just know about Otis. He worked with him. Trusted him. Daniel found a second letter, this one addressed to Brandon. It was unopened. "Brandon never saw this," he whispered. And they stared at the envelope for a moment before Linda opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a short note. "Son, I understand your feelings, but you must consider the future. Some choices cannot be undone. Think carefully about what you are willing to sacrifice." Eleanor sat down slowly. He was trying to scare him. To control him, Linda added. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implication. Then Daniel reached for another envelope, this one addressed to Otis. The postmark was dated just 3 days before the wedding. "I'm beginning to think the key Gregory had wasn't just for an office," Lyndon said slowly. "It might be a storage unit, one holding something Daniel nodded grimly. We should tell Pram. But Linda had another idea forming. What if we find it ourselves? That night, Linda couldn't sleep. The image of that key haunted her. She kept visualizing it. The half-hidden label, Gregory's startled reaction. It was more than a coincidence. It was a sign. Early the next morning, Linda called Daniel. "Do you remember exactly what the key looked like?" she asked. He hesitated. Kind of. It had a white label, a smudge on the side, and I think it said something like O Store 6, or maybe O Unit 6. I only saw it for a second. That sounds like a storage unit, Linda said. We need to check local rental facilities. They met at a coffee shop near downtown and spread out a map. There were a half-dozen storage sites nearby, and Daniel made calls while Linda searched online. After 30 minutes, they had a lead. An Otis Graham had rented Unit 6 at Everglades Secure Storage starting in June 1985. The lease had been renewed by another name later, G. Whitmore. That's it, Daniel whispered. He took it over after Melissa and Brandon disappeared. They drove there without calling Pram. Something told Linda that Gregory might try to block access if they waited. At the facility, Daniel showed ID and explained the situation. The attendant, a tired man with a thick accent, reluctantly agreed to escort them to Unit 6. The lock on the unit was rusted but intact. Daniel broke the seal with a bolt cutter the attendant provided. Inside it was dark and damp. Dust swirled in the air as Linda stepped in. Boxes lined the shelves. Most were unmarked, but a few bore the name G. Whitmore. She opened one. Inside were tapes. Dozens of VHS cassettes, all dated around 1985. One was labeled Wedding Raw Footage. Linda's hands trembled. They gathered everything they could carry and left quickly, promising to return with a warrant for the rest. Back at Linda's home, Daniel connected an old VCR to the TV. They inserted the tape. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Melissa was smiling, radiant in her gown, but behind her stood a figure. Otis Graham. He wasn't watching the ceremony. He was watching her. And he wasn't smiling. From her vantage point, Linda had an unobstructed view of the low-rise building, marked with the sleek, modern logo of Gregory Whitmore's real estate company. Almost every resident in Homestead had heard of his firm. It dominated the town's skyline, shaped zoning laws, and influenced decisions in boardrooms and backrooms alike. But today it wasn't the gleaming glass front or well-kept landscaping that held her attention. It was what, or who, was inside. She had parked her car discreetly across the street, half concealed behind a delivery truck that had come to drop off supplies for the small cafe next door. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as she exhaled slowly. She couldn't quite believe she was doing this, trailing Gregory, monitoring his movements like some amateur sleuth in a paperback thriller. But the unease that had settled in her bones over the last few days pushed her forward. She reminded herself of what was at stake. The monogrammed necklace, the cryptic letters from Otis, the way Gregory had reacted to the key, his sudden departures, his evasive answers. There were too many coincidences, too many secrets buried beneath a polished exterior. The black Mercedes sat idling at the curb outside the building. Its windows were tinted, but she could make out silhouettes shifting inside. At precisely 10:30 a.m., Gregory emerged from the main entrance, walking briskly, glancing at his watch. He still wore the same slacks and blazer from that morning's encounter, but now looked visibly more agitated. His jaw was clenched, his movements tight and impatient. From the other side of the vehicle, a man exited and walked toward Gregory. Linda recognized him from the wedding footage. Otis Graham. Taller than she remembered, and still dressed in tailored gray, he moved with a kind of calculated confidence. Gregory handed him a set of keys. keys to the Mercedes, and in return, Otis passed over another set. Linda's heart skipped a beat. Gregory climbed into the driver's seat of the Mercedes without another word, and Otis casually walked to a reserved parking space where Daniel's BMW was now parked. He got in and drove away. She remained frozen, unsure of what she had just witnessed. A car switch? Why? Why now? And why had Otis, of all people, taken the BMW? The questions spun in her mind, but a moment later, she started her engine and cautiously pulled out of her hiding spot. If Gregory was going somewhere, she needed to follow. She kept a safe distance, tailing the Mercedes through a winding route that took them far from the downtown core and into a quieter industrial area near the outskirts of Homestead. Eventually, he turned into a narrow, gated lot beside a row of shuttered warehouses. The sign above the lot read, "Whitmore Holdings, Private Storage." She parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, staying behind a large hedge. Gregory pulled into a garage bay and waited. Moments later, a metal door rolled open and another figure appeared, an older man with a clipboard. They exchanged brief words, and the man handed Gregory another set of keys and waved him inside. Linda's breath caught. Another storage site. As the doors began to close behind them, she memorized the number painted on the concrete wall, Unit 22B. She hurried back to her car and called Daniel. "I just followed your dad. He's accessing something in another storage facility, Unit 22B. Daniel was silent for a moment. "That's not one of our company's listed assets." "I don't think it's official," Linda said. "We need to tell Detective Pram." "I'll meet you at the station." Linda drove straight to the Homestead Police Department. Pram was waiting, already reviewing the latest updates from forensics. He raised his eyebrows as she recounted what she'd seen. "This is the third facility tied to Gregory," he said. "That's more than a coincidence." He ordered officers to secure a warrant and headed out with the team. By afternoon, they had arrived at the industrial site. Gregory was gone, but the unit was still locked. They broke the padlock and lifted the roll-up door. Inside was a room filled with boxes, metal cabinets, and a long table covered in neatly stacked documents. But what drew everyone's attention was the shelf at the far wall. It held dozens of labeled VHS tapes. Some dated before the wedding, others after. And in the corner, partially obscured by a canvas tarp, sat a framed photo. There was Melissa, standing beside Otis. They were smiling, but in the background, behind the shot, Gregory could be seen, his expression grim. The silence in the room was palpable. "This changes everything," Pram murmured. As the officers carefully examined the space, Pram motioned for one of the techs to begin cataloging the contents. "I want these tapes digitized as soon as possible," he said. "We need to know what's on them." Linda stood near the door, absorbing every detail. Her gaze wandered to a worn leather-bound notebook lying half-concealed beneath a stack of invoices. She picked it up gently and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. The first entry was dated just days before the wedding. "Otis met with Brandon again," it read. "He remains unconvinced. Brandon refuses to back down. Melissa is too strong-willed. She's changed him." Linda flipped forward. "Another note. Gregory says we need to accelerate plans. She's digging too deep, already asking questions." She stopped, hand trembling. The entries didn't just hint at disapproval. They hinted at manipulation, surveillance, and fear. Daniel, who had arrived moments earlier, stood beside her. "What is that?" he asked softly. "A journal. It's Otis's or Gregory's, maybe both." Pram joined them. This could be critical. They continued to explore the storage unit. Behind a sliding panel, they discovered more photos, some clearly taken without Melissa or Brandon's knowledge. In one, Brandon appeared angry, mid-argument with Gregory outside the family estate. Another showed Melissa, alone in a park, reading. All were dated, all carefully archived. Linda couldn't help but feel the noose tightening around something intangible. A web of intentions that had once been invisible, now materializing in front of her. Later that evening, the police station buzzed with quiet energy. Analysts reviewed the first few minutes of the digitalized tapes. One clip stood out, a conversation between Gregory and Otis. "We can't let her take him," Otis was saying. "You know what that means for the legacy." Gregory responded calmly, "I'll handle it. The wedding is just a distraction. Afterward, we'll make sure she understands." Or disappears. The room fell silent. Linda closed her eyes. Tears welled up, not just from sorrow, but from vindication. She hadn't been wrong, not all those years ago. Melissa hadn't left. She had been taken. And now the truth was surfacing, frame by frame, word by word. The past was finally speaking, and it was furious. Linda crouched motionless in the thick Everglades underbrush, her heartbeat pounding like war drums against her ribs. She strained to hear every word coming from the two men not far ahead. Gregory's voice was unmistakable, low, commanding, but it was Otis's reply that chilled her blood. "I'll do it, for the money," Otis said finally, after a tense pause. Linda couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her body went cold, her mind screaming for her to move, to act, but she forced herself to stay still. The ferns rustled gently around her as the men turned to leave. "Smart choice," Gregory muttered. "Let's go, it's getting late." Their silhouettes moved back through the dense trail they had entered from, boots crunching softly on damp leaves and twigs. Linda remained hidden, buried deep beneath the thick curtain of sawgrass and vines. She didn't dare breathe until their footsteps had completely faded. Then, trembling, she reached for her phone. Her fingers were slick with sweat, her thumb fumbling over the screen as she dialed Detective Prom's direct line. A moment passed. The signal flickered. Just 2 bars, not strong, but hopefully enough. The line crackled. "Detective, it's Linda Carroll," she whispered frantically. "I'm at Everglades National Park, Long Pine Key area. I followed Gregory Whitmore. He's here with a man named Otis. I heard everything. Otis admitted to burying Melissa's body here. Gregory's paying him to take the fall for both murders." "Mrs. Carroll," Pram's voice came through, tinged with static. "Can you repeat that?" "Gregory is orchestrating everything. He's making Otis confess in his place. He's paying him probably to disappear after." "Stay where you are," Pram said. "We're dispatching units now. Do not engage. I repeat, stay hidden until we arrive." Linda ended the call, her breath hitching. The jungle around her suddenly felt alive with tension, like every tree and shadow held its breath alongside her. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Every sound, the distant call of a heron, the rustle of a lizard darting past, made her flinch, but she didn't move. She couldn't risk compromising the one chance they had at finally exposing the truth. Then came the faint whup, whup, whup of helicopter blades. She looked up, shielding her eyes as a black helicopter emerged over the canopy, followed by the distant wail of sirens. The cavalry had arrived. Within moments, the jungle erupted into coordinated motion. Officers in tactical gear emerged from the trailheads, converging on the area where Gregory and Otis had gone. A team of search dogs barked sharply, weaving through the ferns with purpose. Linda stood slowly, arms raised in surrender just in case. "Ma'am?" A uniformed officer ran up to her, radio crackling. "Are you Linda Carroll?" "Yes, he went that way. Gregory, Otis. They're probably trying to get out now." He nodded sharply, signaling to a colleague. "We've got her. Start sweep southeast." Linda was ushered back to the edge of the parking lot. where Prom was climbing out of an SUV. "You heard it yourself?" he asked, barely concealing his urgency. "Every word," she confirmed. "Gregory's trying to bury this, again." Over the next hour, officers fanned out. By late afternoon, both men were in custody. Otis had been found pacing near an old ranger station, looking like a man already exhausted by the weight of guilt. Gregory was discovered attempting to escape via a service road, covered in sweat, mud streaked across his shoes. His eyes met Linda's briefly as he was cuffed and led past her. There was no rage in them, only resignation. Back at the station, Otis confessed under pressure. Everything. How Gregory had cornered him after the wedding, how he had been offered hush money, and how Melissa had confronted Gregory about financial discrepancies. She threatened to go public. That night, she never made it home. Brandon had found out. He confronted Gregory. He never made it back either. They buried both bodies in a remote section of the park. Otis had kept it quiet for 12 years, until the truth finally clawed its way to the surface. In the following hours, the investigation took on a life of its own. Forensic teams were deployed to the exact location Linda had indicated. Shovels hit the soft earth, and slowly, methodically, the Everglades began to give up its secrets. Beneath layers of wet soil and tangled roots, the remnants of a shallow grave came to light. Personal items surfaced first. A locket, rusted with time, the initials MC still faintly visible. Pieces of a wedding dress, tattered and soaked in mud. A silver watch, its face shattered but still ticking faintly, now stilled forever. Then came the bones. The site was cordoned off. Specialists arrived in white suits and gloves, painstakingly removing each piece with reverence and care. Linda stood at the edge, hands clasped tightly, tears falling freely. It was the closure she had longed for, but it came wrapped in grief so deep it stole her breath. Daniel joined her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I had no idea how far my father would go." Linda turned to him. "You helped bring the truth forward. That's what matters now." Back at the station, Gregory remained silent through most of the interrogation. But once Otis's signed confession was presented, and after hours of cross-examination, his facade began to crack. At first he claimed ignorance, then misunderstanding, but eventually, like a dam breaking, the truth came rushing out. He had orchestrated it all, the manipulation, the cover-up, even the silence of witnesses, bought with intimidation or bribes. He had done it, he admitted, for the family, for legacy. The courtroom was packed during his trial. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. The community that had once admired the Whitmores now watched as their empire crumbled, piece by piece. Gregory sat stone-faced, occasionally glancing at Daniel, who refused to return his gaze. Otis, in exchange for full cooperation and a complete account of the events, was sentenced to 25 years. Gregory Whitmore received life without parole. On the day of sentencing, Linda visited the site where Melissa and Brandon were finally laid to rest properly. A new headstone stood there now, bearing both their names. Fresh flowers lay at its base. "I found you," she whispered, "and I'll never stop loving you." In the breeze that rustled the grass around her, Linda felt it, a faint warmth, a peace long denied, finally settling in. The past, no longer buried, was finally at rest. Linda watched the sun dip lower, casting long golden rays across the Everglades and painting the sky with streaks of orange and deep purple. The humid air clung to her skin, thick with tension, the taste of adrenaline still lingering on her tongue. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of tires crunching gravel reached her ears. She turned, her pulse quickening. A silver BMW rolled to a stop at the edge of the lot. Eleanor stepped out first, followed closely by Daniel. Their faces bore the strain of confusion and concern, their movements brisk, urgent. "Linda, what's going on?" Daniel called out, glancing toward the police perimeter. "We got a call saying Dad was here. Eleanor told me he's been detained," Eleanor added, eyes darting between Linda and the uniformed officers nearby. "What's happening?" Linda drew a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I followed your father. I witnessed him meeting Otis Graham in the Everglades. I overheard their conversation. Gregory offered Otis money to take full responsibility for Melissa and Brandon's deaths." Silence dropped over the trio like a shroud. Daniel's eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly. Eleanor took a step back, her expression flickering through disbelief, confusion, and then dread. "That's not possible," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "Gregory wouldn't. He couldn't." But Daniel didn't speak. His gaze stayed locked on the sight of his father, cuffed, guarded by officers. His features were tight, unreadable. Slowly, he folded his arms, exhaling a shaky breath. "Actually," he said quietly, "it makes a terrible kind of sense." "What are you talking about?" Eleanor snapped, spinning to face her son. "You think your father is capable of something like this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I've been questioning a lot of things lately, Mom. Dad's behavior, his secrecy, the accounts he kept hidden, his obsession with control, especially around Melissa." He turned to Linda. "Did you get all of it? The conversation?" "I heard enough," Linda said, "enough to know he wanted this covered up forever." A new voice interrupted them. Detective Pram had approached quietly, a folder in his hand. "We've gathered sufficient audio and witness testimony," he said, "and Otis has given us a formal statement. But we still need corroboration." He handed Daniel a page, an inventory list. "We recovered several more tapes from the second storage unit," Pram explained. "One of them shows Gregory meeting with Otis the night after the wedding. The timestamp matches the night Melissa disappeared." Eleanor looked as though she might faint. She leaned against the police cruiser, eyes glassy. "Bastard," she whispered. "He used all of us. For years." As officers moved to transport Gregory, Linda stood a little straighter. She met Gregory's gaze as he was led past her, handcuffed and silent. For a moment, his expression shifted. Not fear, not shame, but something hollow, as if the weight of everything he had built was finally crumbling under its own rot. The sun dipped lower still, bathing the world in the dusky glow of coming night. But for the first time in 12 years, Linda felt clarity. And she wasn't alone anymore. As the cruiser carrying Gregory disappeared from view, a strange hush fell over the scene. The Everglades, always so full of life, seemed to pause in mourning. Linda remained still, the heat and humidity pressing against her, but her focus was unwavering. She'd spent over a decade chasing shadows, piecing together fragments of a story no one wanted to believe. Now, the final act was underway. Daniel slowly moved to stand beside her. "You're right," he said, voice rough. "I owe you more than I can say." Linda looked at him with tired eyes. "You owe it to Melissa. You helped uncover what so many worked to keep hidden." He nodded, then turned toward Eleanor, who stood at a distance, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her expression was one of quiet devastation, the kind that comes from the sudden collapse of everything once believed solid. Linda approached her slowly. "I know you're hurting," she said gently, "but you need to understand. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision. A series of them." Eleanor nodded slowly, still not meeting Linda's eyes. "He lied to me for years. I defended him. I stood beside him every time someone questioned his integrity. And that's what he counted on," Linda said. "Your loyalty, your silence." That, Eleanor looked up, eyes sharp with fresh understanding. "No more," she said quietly. "I won't be part of the lie any longer." The police continued to catalog evidence. More tapes, journals, photographs, each one another nail in the coffin of Gregory's carefully constructed image. As night fell, generators buzzed and floodlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the Everglades. Linda sat on the edge of a folding chair provided by the officers. Detective Pram came by again, this time with coffee and updates. "We'll need official statements tomorrow," he said, "but for tonight, you've done enough. You've brought peace to a place where there was none." Linda sipped her coffee slowly. "It's not peace yet, but it's a start." Later that evening, as she returned to her quiet home, Linda walked past the framed photo of Melissa on the mantel. The smile in that picture was one of promise, of beginnings never fulfilled. Linda touched the frame gently. "You mattered," she whispered. "And now they all know it." Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deeper than any night in 12 long years. The storm had passed, and the truth remained. The next morning brought overcast skies and the scent of coming rain. Linda stood once again at the Everglades entrance, this time not as a seeker of secrets, but as a bearer of truths. Media vans lined the roads, antennas raised like curious eyes. Reporters buzzed around the site, each hoping to capture a sliver of the now unfolding story. Linda, accompanied by Daniel and Eleanor, stepped through the police barricade. Pram greeted them with nods of respect. "You're the reason this is happening," he told Linda. "You pushed when others stopped. Melissa and Brandon deserve justice, and you didn't let them fade into legend." Nearby, a team of archaeologists began their careful exhumation. Every artifact, every trace of the past was recorded with meticulous care. As Daniel watched them work, he spoke quietly to Linda. "I thought the truth would destroy me, that finding out my father was a monster would be unbearable, but now I realize silence was worse." Linda placed a hand on his shoulder. "Truth hurts, but it heals too, eventually." Together, they approached the makeshift memorial growing near the site. Flowers, photos, candles, and notes from strangers who had followed the case. One card stood out. It read, "She was loved. She is not forgotten." Linda knelt to place a single white rose beside it. Her fingers brushed the grass, her lips parted in a silent prayer. "Rest easy, my darling girl," she whispered. "We found our way back to you." This time, there would be no more unanswered questions, no more buried truths. Only the light of justice shining through. It was still daylight outside, but inside the police station's interview room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken sorrow. The light filtering through the blinds created horizontal shadows across the walls, giving the room a somber, almost confessional air. Detective Jason Pram sat opposite Linda, his movements calm, voice low and deliberate. He offered her coffee, which she declined politely, water, which she accepted gratefully, sipping with trembling hands. "First," he said, folding his hands on the table, "I want to say how deeply sorry I am. No parent should have to endure what you've gone through. 12 years of uncertainty, of silence, of not knowing if your child was out there suffering, or worse. That was all it took." The words struck something inside Linda that she had worked so hard to protect for over a decade. Her tears came hot, unbidden, falling freely down her cheeks. During the chaos at the Everglades, she had managed to remain composed, driven by adrenaline and shock. But now, in the safety of this quiet space, faced with simple human kindness, her walls crumbled. "At least now I know," she whispered between sobs. "All these years I lived with nightmares. I wondered, was she trapped somewhere, calling for me, hurt and alone? Or had she chosen to leave me behind, Had she run away to start a life I wasn't part of? Her voice cracked. But now I know she's not in pain anymore. She wasn't tortured. She wasn't locked away somewhere in fear. She couldn't finish. Her voice broke completely and she dropped her head into her hands, shoulders shaking. Detective Pram gently pushed a box of tissues across the table. "I understand," he said softly, "and I promise we'll go through everything. But first I need to take your formal statement. Then I'll tell you what Otis revealed during his confession. It's difficult, but you have every right to know." Lyndon nodded slowly, composing herself. Her voice was still shaky when she responded. "I'm ready. Ask me what you need." The detective pulled out a recorder and a form. "This is for the official record," he said, switching the device on. "Please state your name and the date." She complied. He began with basic questions: where she had gone that morning, how she came to follow Gregory, and what exactly she witnessed at the clearing in the Everglades. Linda recounted everything, each word, each look between the two men. She described their tones, the urgency, the way Gregory had spoken like someone giving orders, not seeking forgiveness. She described Otis's hesitance, his weariness, and ultimately, his grim acceptance. When she finished, Pram nodded. "Thank you. That was brave. Now, here's what Otis told us." He leaned forward, voice low. According to Otis Graham's testimony, everything began unraveling on the night of the wedding. Melissa had stumbled across suspicious financial records while helping Gregory finalize some last-minute documentation. She confronted him privately, and their conversation escalated quickly. Gregory was afraid she would expose his embezzlement. Funds stolen not just from his own company, but from charities, investors, even family trusts. He feared not only disgrace, but prison. When Brandon found out what had happened, perhaps Melissa had confided in him, he went to Gregory too. Otis claimed the young man was furious, threatening to involve the authorities. Otis had been hired by Gregory years ago for quiet jobs, mostly intimidation or surveillance. But this time, Gregory made it clear he needed Otis to silence the problem, permanently. The price was high, but Otis agreed. The next day, while the newlyweds were supposed to be en route to their honeymoon, Otis lured them under false pretenses to a remote section of the Everglades. What happened there was quick and brutal. Brandon was killed first, struck from behind while arguing with Otis, who had staged it as a car breakdown. Melissa tried to flee, but she was cornered. She pleaded for her life, begged. She cried for her mother, Otis had said, according to Pram. "Even in her last moments, she was thinking of you." Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Otis claimed he didn't want to kill her, that he hesitated, but Gregory arrived just in time to ensure it was done. "They buried the bodies together," Pram said. "Gregory insisted it be deep enough that no one would stumble across it. He paid Otis for the job and told him to disappear." Linda sat frozen, her heart aching with every word. She pictured Melissa's final moments, frightened, betrayed, thinking of home, and Brandon, trying to protect her. "Well now," she asked hoarsely. "Why would Otis come forward after all these years?" "Money ran out," Pram said simply. "And guilt catches up to you eventually. We're still verifying the full details, but we have physical evidence matching Otis's account, and Gregory's fingerprints are all over the forged documents Melissa discovered." Linda sat back, drained, but even through the pain there was something new settling in her chest, a fierce resolve. "They'll both pay," she whispered. "They will," Pram affirmed. "That I promise you." After finishing the statement, Linda stepped out of the interview room and found herself in the quiet corridor of the police station. It was strange how ordinary the place looked, with fluorescent lights buzzing softly and the low murmur of officers going about their duties. Everything felt surreal. She had imagined the moment of truth for so long, dozens of versions playing out in her mind, but none of them had looked like this. She walked toward a small bench near the exit, and as she sat down, Daniel joined her. His face was pale, and his eyes were hollow with the weight of truth he now carried. "You told me sometime," she said. "I stayed," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I listened to everything." Linda looked at him. "You didn't have to." "I did," he replied, "because she was my sister in a way, and you were right about everything." Linda nodded slowly, letting the silence hang. A few minutes passed before she spoke again. "You're not him, Daniel. You're not your father. What you choose to do next matters." "I want to testify," he said firmly, "in court against him. I'll tell them everything I know. I've spent too long living under his shadow. It ends here." Tears welled in Linda's eyes again, this time from something close to gratitude. "That would mean a lot." Later, as Linda drove home, the city around her looked different. The world hadn't changed, but she had. The truth had emerged, and though it had torn open old wounds, it had also begun to heal them. As she pulled into her driveway and stepped out into the quiet of the evening, she glanced at the stars above. Somewhere out there, Melissa was watching. And for the first time in years, Linda could finally whisper, "We did it." The next few days moved in a blur. Media outlets ran the story non-stop. Headlines blared about the fall of a respected businessman, a long-buried secret unearthed, and a mother's unwavering pursuit of justice. Linda fielded interview requests from reporters, but she declined most. The spotlight had never interested her. All she had ever wanted was the truth. Instead, she spent time preparing for the legal process ahead. Prosecutors worked swiftly, building a strong case with the testimony of Otis, the recovered tapes, the forged financial records, and, most powerfully, Daniel's commitment to testify against his own father. His courage became a turning point. One afternoon, Linda received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words inside brought tears to her eyes. It was from a young woman who had grown up hearing about the disappearance of Melissa Carroll. She wrote that Linda's strength had inspired her to speak up about injustices in her own life. That moment crystallized everything. What began as a mother's anguish had grown into something larger, a legacy of truth, resilience, and refusal to give up, no matter how many years passed. Linda folded the letter and placed it beside the photo of Melissa on her mantel. The past could never be undone, but now it would never be hidden again. Justice had found its voice, and it spoke with hers. Daniel gently squeezed his mother's shoulder one last time before stepping away. "I'll update you both after," he said, then turned to follow Detective Pram into another room for questioning. An officer approached Linda and Eleanor. "Ladies, I need to separate you into different waiting areas. Standard procedure during ongoing interviews." Eleanor was led down one hallway, her heels clicking faintly on the polished floor. Linda was escorted in the opposite direction, into a small, quiet room furnished with only 4 chairs and a low table stacked with outdated magazines. The moment the officer closed the door behind her, the weight of the day, of the years, finally descended. She collapsed into one of the chairs, breath catching in her throat. For the first time since the nightmare began, she was completely, undeniably alone. No detectives, no grieving family members, no swirling media, just herself and the stillness. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. She stared blankly at the wall, not really seeing anything. In that silence, memories surged forward. Melissa's laughter echoing from childhood rooms, Brandon's respectful nods, the sound of a wedding gown brushing tile, and the empty spaces that followed. A tear slid down her cheek, followed by another. But these weren't tears of confusion or helplessness. They were the tears of release. For 12 years she had lived suspended, held by the sharp thread of hope, afraid to let go but tormented by its grip. Today, that thread had snapped, and in its place was a strange, aching clarity. She whispered aloud to no one, "I ain't give up on you." It was a promise kept. And though the road ahead would still be long, filled with trials, testimonies, and memories that would never fully heal, there was now a path forward. A door had opened, and on the other side, Linda could almost feel the sun rising again.